Okay, tonight we're starting off with the end of the Jeffersonian theory of how government should operate. That is almost entirely the result of the disaster that was the War of 1812. The war that the United States fought against Britain from 1812 to 1815, early 1815. Many of the major policy decisions that the Republican Party had made, going all the way back to 1801 when they took power, when Jefferson went into the presidency, proved in the long term to be fairly disastrous. They reduced the military size, they reduced military funding, they dramatically reduced internal taxes, they based almost all national tax revenue off of tariffs. Of course, when you go to war with your number one economic trade partner, that collapses the amount of trade going on. Therefore, the taxes that you get as a result of that trade plummet. So U.S. government revenues absolutely plummet when the war broke out. And because they didn't have any really internal tax laws on the books, the United States really struggled to pay for the war even while they're fighting it. So they went to war with an underfunded government and a tiny military, trying to take on what was one of the giant military powers of the planet. And it didn't work out very well for the United States. And a lot of kind of the new rising generation of American political leaders seem to understand those mistakes very clearly in the immediate aftermath of the war. The war ended in about January 1815, and the political leadership understood what had happened, and they start taking major steps to reverse what they saw as the major mistakes, and largely bring back a whole lot of Hamilton's ideas from the 1790s that had so heavily strengthened the U.S. economically and politically in some ways. So I want to go through the changes that were made to U.S. fiscal policy, then foreign policy, and eventually we'll talk about the dominance of the Republican Party even while all this is going on. So Madison is still president. He was reelected in 1812, so his second term of office would go through if he decides not to run for a third term in 1816. His second term of office would end in March of 1817. So when the war ends in very early 1815, President Madison still has 2 years left in his second term. Very quickly, Congress, the Republican-dominated Congress, proposes to rebuild one of the centerpieces of Hamilton's financial scheme, his so-called financial grand design, which was the National Bank. And Congress very quickly passes legislation to rebuild what they will then call the Second Bank of the United States. And President Madison signed it, and that law passed, and the bank came into existence again, which is a massive turn of ideology for Madison and a massive turn of government policy for the Republican Party in general. The party and Madison himself, who had personally resisted the creation of a bank in the 1790s, he is now completely shifting his view 20 years later to rebuild the thing under his own watch. So this new wave of Republican leaders, and we'll get into some of the names a little bit later, these so-called young Republicans of the post-war period take a major step, and they do it very quickly, to rebuild the kind of creditworthiness and the ability to borrow money and house it in one kind of central bank, one central treasury. Very quickly after that, the Congress proposes a new tariff system because the Jefferson administration had reduced tariffs to a certain extent, except on places like Britain. During the war, when foreign trade really collapsed, as foreign trade tended to do back then in countries at war, very few boats are willing to risk trading with the United States, traveling to the United States and back across the Atlantic Ocean, for instance, because the British Navy is always lurking around. And any boat that trades with the British enemy will be attacked by the British Navy and possibly destroyed, sunk. and people arrested or killed and the cargo seized. So it's very dangerous to trade with the United States when the U.S. is at war against the biggest naval power in the world. So trade collapsed. That caused a gigantic problem for internal manufacturing companies within the United States and the U.S. market in general. When they stop importing things, they don't get the manufactured goods, the things that are made in factories from Britain and from Europe, because the United States is at war. So internally, domestically, within the United States, those goods that are made in factories become rare and the prices skyrocket. So a lot of average people who use that stuff on a daily basis, like farmers who use shovels and picks and whatnot, they need to buy that stuff from somewhere, and they're very much economically hurt by the rise in prices and the increasing scarcity of those kinds of products. So the United States Congress, after the war is over, proposes a new tariff to raise tariff prices. And the tariff of 1816 raises the taxes on imports of a whole lot of different goods as much as 20 to 25% of their market value. What is the purpose in doing that? Why does the government want to do that? What happens when you raise tariffs like that? Exactly. When there's a certain demand for, say podiums in the United States, and most of the podiums being bought and sold in the United States are made in France or Britain. When those things stop being imported, the value of each individual one skyrockets, right? Supply and demand. Does that make sense? When they become rare, the price goes up. In order to avoid that happening in the future, to have a more stable source of whatever people are buying in the market, the government wants to encourage U.S. companies to make that stuff. The best way to encourage those companies to make it is to convince American buyers to buy American-made products. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to raise taxes on that thing that is made anywhere else. And if it's made anywhere else in the world, it has to be imported, has to go through the customs process. So these tariffs are literally taxes on imports. And the tariff of 1816 is known as one of the really powerful protectionist tariffs, which means the government is not just raising taxes on imports just to gain tax revenue. They're raising taxes on imports because they know that those companies don't want to pay those taxes. So those companies will force their buyers to pay it by raising their prices at the market. So at that point, Walmart theory kicks in. Basically, if any buyer goes to a store, and say a table store, and they see a whole bunch of tables lined up, made from all different countries, and the prices of all foreign-made tables are 20 or 25% higher than an American-made product. If they're about the same thing, which one do people tend to buy? The cheaper one, because they want to save money. So if you can force foreign-made goods to have their prices raised, then American companies can sell their products at a lower value and still make enough money to turn profit. And, the theory of people want to save money, they will go to the cheapest product as long as they're somewhat comparable. That kicks in, and that's why they call it protectionist tariff. It protects domestic manufacturers, domestic companies that are making tables or podiums or water bottles or computers or whatever you're talking about. And it's very, very successful. The tariff of 1816 convinces American buyers to buy American-made things. Therefore, American companies grow, and therefore the American market is producing all the industrial goods, not all of it, but a good portion of it, that they need going into the future. Therefore, if another war breaks out against Britain, or another European company, or one of those industrialized companies at some point in the future, the American market is already making everything it needs. It doesn't have to rely on imports anymore. Does that make sense? The United States becomes more economically independent, especially of Britain. And that's the trick of the tariff. And these tariffs are around for a long time, right in through the 1900s, and they're hugely successful. Are the tariffs still around today? No, they've largely been removed. And when that started happening in the 1970s, 1980s, that's where you started seeing mass layoffs in American companies, where those American jobs that were protected by tariffs, once you remove the tariffs, those jobs start going overseas to cheaper labor sources. And your politicians don't want to talk about it, but that is a gigantic reason for the mass unemployment that we have. And American businessmen will tell you. I mean, there's a story that President Obama cornered Steve Jobs a couple years ago at a kind of large industrialist kind of meeting with the president. Literally put Steve Jobs into the side of a wall and said, what do we have to do to get iPhones made in the United States instead of made in China? And what does Steve Jobs say? Nothing. There's nothing you can do, because I can pay Chinese workers 40 cents an hour. Whereas if unionized American labor makes that stuff, I have to pay them, $20 or $30 an hour. So these tariffs, they sound complex, they sound, kind of mathematical and dorky, but they have a huge impact on your daily lives. And the daily lives of anyone who's worked in a factory in, say, the past 100 years or 200 years. These are hugely, fundamentally important things, especially in foreign and economic policy. So the Tariff of 1816, you'll read about in textbooks and whatnot. It is a symbolic tariff that's passed very quickly after the war, where, again, the Republicans are now coming to the awareness that they have to do something to foster, to help domestic businesses, U.S. factory systems, U.S. businesses to grow, so that the United States can become independent. This is the kind of stuff that Hamilton demanded when he was Secretary of the Treasury, and demanded throughout the 1790s. And he largely got a lot of that stuff put into place. It was removed by Jefferson and others, and now it's come back, because the Republicans, and even Madison himself, have learned the natural results of what they had done in the early 1800s. By removing a lot of these systems. Another thing that these so-called young Republicans or new Republicans also try to pass in Madison's final year is called the Transportation Act, which is exactly what Madison or what Hamilton had demanded in the 1790s. The United States should take federal government tax revenue to build transportation systems. By this point, railroads, canals, and highways to link the different sectors of the American economy, and to allow easier transportation, shipping of goods and services back and forth. And Hamilton said if you do that, it would be a very small investment. They'd be big infrastructure projects, but it would be a great investment for the long term. Now, it's another piece of Hamilton's kind of big idea for what the U.S. economy should look like that was removed to a huge extent by the Republican Party and by President Jefferson in the early 1800s. They thought that was not the proper role of the national government, that especially Madison, even up to this point, believed that these transportation systems were the responsibility of cities and states, that the federal government didn't have any place in that. And he said there's no place in the Constitution that gives the federal government the power to build those kinds of systems. So he actually vetoed that one. So that law didn't go into effect under his watch. But Madison, by this point, 1816, is fairly unpopular because he led the U.S. into this disastrous war that he really can't run for a third term. So in 1816, he decides to retire. And he upholds the precedent set by Washington and Jefferson before him of serving 2 terms as president and then leaving. So a new president comes into office, wins the election of 1816, goes into office in March 1817, and almost immediately has a new Transportation Act put on his desk, and he signs it. This guy's name is Monroe. He was Madison's Secretary of State. So Monroe and the other Republican leaders are going to push what they start calling economic nationalism, the use of federal government money to build transportation systems, to rebuild the tariff, to build the bank, to do a whole lot of different things that the kind of old guard Republicans, the Jeffersonian types of people, had either resisted or actively destroyed. So, questions about any of this so far? Basically, this stuff is all against what Jefferson believed and what Jefferson built the Republican Party on opposing. And here's a kind of simplistic map of a lot of the different projects that start getting built, especially the railroads and canals. And you can see most of it is located in the northern part of the country. That's where the big cities were. That's where the big factory systems were starting to pop up. So there was a feeling that the federal government should really come together and link those together first. And also because a lot of the Southerners were agrarian-based, they were farming-based, and so they were the part of the country that really clung to Jefferson's Yeoman Republic idea, the idea that the country should be built up by small-time farmers, and that the government shouldn't be investing in banking systems and transportation and helping out commerce. So the Jeffersonian idea is still pretty strong in the South, so a lot of Southern politicians, even when they're offered the opportunity to build railroads, they resist it. So by default, at first, most of the big projects are built in the North, and especially the Northeast, where the big cities are. Let's see, and this is just a general map by, what is this, 1817. So right at the point we're at here, you can see the addition of new states: Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. Louisiana has come in because of the population at New Orleans. So the United States is growing and is claiming more territory out west and starting to name these different territories. So there's a very general idea that the United States is expanding westward and will eventually carve the whole Louisiana territory, or what on this map is called the Missouri Territory, will carve all that up into new states. And that a lot of Americans believe that that was inevitable, that that was going to happen almost no matter what. As the United States starts building up more and more infrastructure on a national level, many state-level politicians and many old guard Republicans didn't like that this was going on, maybe the kind of Jeffersonian types of people. So one state in particular, Maryland, attempted to tax its state branch of the new national bank. The state of Maryland wanted to tax a federal institution, federal property, for state revenue. So a controversy breaks out between which group should have more power in the country, the individual states or the federal government. And when Maryland tried to tax its branch, or one of its branches of the federal bank, the federal government basically sued the state of Maryland. And this lawsuit works its way all the way through the court system, eventually gets to the Supreme Court, and the decision rendered by Chief Justice Marshall is pretty clear-cut. The federal government wins. The decision says that the Constitution gives Congress the implied powers under the Implied Powers Clause to implement its constitutional goals, like interstate commerce, which is specifically listed in the Constitution as something that Congress should do, or the federal government should do, but specifically Congress. And at the end of Article 1, there's a statement in there that says, okay, we've listed a whole bunch of things that Congress is empowered to do, but Congress also has the power to build up systems to actually implement that stuff, to fulfill those powers. And under this reading of the Constitution, this building of a second bank is permitted under the Constitution. The Congress is allowed to do that on the national level. And the Congress is existing at a higher level than any individual state. This basically says that the federal government is more powerful and more important than any individual state. the federal government overshadows each state. And when a controversy breaks out between, who's more important, who should have more power, one state or the federal government, in this interpretation it says the federal government always wins. And this is a hugely important decision because the legal ramifications still come down to us today. And this is just, the lawsuit was kind of narrow based on the one state taxing one part of the national government. But the court interpreted it in a very large way. No state can do anything that taxes or otherwise destroys national property. And in doing that, Marshall really goes after and tries to eliminate the states' rights argument. The idea that states should share power with the federal government or have maybe even more power than the federal government. The Supreme Court steps in and really puts his foot down and says absolutely not. The federal government is supreme in all instances whatsoever. And that's still a theory that, for the most part, the U.S. federal government still runs on today. So, questions about this one at all? No. Okay. Moving forward. So, everything we've done with fiscal policy, the idea that the Republican Party is now kind of upending its former ideology and going against its major founder, Jefferson's ideology, in fiscal policy is true in almost every instance. Foreign policy is a mixed bag. The United States starts doing things foreign policy-wise that Jefferson would have supported some of the time, and Jefferson probably would not have other times. One of the first things that the United States does after the war with Britain is to start signing treaties with Britain, especially treaties regarding the border with Canada, which is still at this point a British colony. Remember, most of the fighting was based around the Great Lakes, U.S. invasions of Canadian lands, British land, and fighting on the actual lakes themselves, naval battles, warships going at each other between the U.S. and Britain. So you get a system of treaties that's generally called the Rush-Bagot Treaties and the so-called Accords of 1818 that literally demilitarize the Great Lakes, which means the U.S. Navy pulls back from the Great Lakes and the British Navy pulls back because they both realize that having their navies in such close proximity to each other is just asking for a battle at some point. That's dangerous stuff. You generally don't want to have two opposing armies sitting right next to each other because, soldiers get in fights and, maybe someone shoots at each other and all of a sudden you have a war. So they start pulling away from each other. They demilitarize the Great Lakes. They give the American fishers some fishing rights off of Newfoundland, which is off to the east. And they stabilize the border at the 49th parallel. This border was very vague for a long time. And there were Americans crossing over into British Canada and Canadians crossing over into the Louisiana Territory because no one really knew where the exact border was. So in 1817, 1818, the U.S. signed a series of treaties with Britain to stabilize the border and get their militaries away from each other. And this is really the beginning of a 100-year process of the Americans and the British really kind of burying the hatchet and burying their bad blood and coming to the realization that they reinforce each other's interests, economic and military interests in the world more than really should be opposed to each other. So that's the first treaty system. Jefferson probably would have been opposed to that to no end because he hated the British. He never wanted to sign any treaty with the British and viewed them as the source of all evil on the planet, basically. The next major treaty that you get is the so-called Transcontinental Treaty, which is basically in regards to Florida. Florida at this point was still a Spanish colony, and so was all of what eventually becomes Mexico. This was still called New Spain, supposedly, or the Spanish Empire. Right around, I believe it's 1812, the peoples living in this Spanish colony go into revolution against Spain. They fight a long revolutionary war for independence. And that's coming to a head right around 1818, 1819. So right as Mexico is declaring independence and winning its war of independence against Spain, there is a controversy that also breaks out in Florida where American settlers in Georgia and the territory of Mississippi, which eventually gets divided between Mississippi and Alabama. So American settlers in those regions are getting attacked by native tribes that they accuse of coming from the Spanish colony. And there's accusations that Spanish traders are selling guns and other kinds of supplies to those natives with full knowledge that the natives are going to go off and attack American settlements. So one American general named Jackson, the same guy who defended New Orleans against the British invasion, takes an army and literally invades Florida, kills a bunch of native groups, takes a bunch of Spanish government figures prisoner, and executes them also. So Jackson basically launches an invasion and starts conquering land in Florida. And at this point, the U.S. Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, sends messages to the Spanish government saying, basically, we are conquering that place piece by piece. So how about if we just buy it from you? You don't have the military to defend it. You couldn't even defend what was eventually becoming Mexico against revolution. So there's no way you're going to be able to defend this little chunk over here. So why don't you just let us buy it from you? If you don't want to sell it to us, then we'll just keep invading and just take it from you. So eventually you get in, 1819, 1820, a transcontinental treaty that literally hands Florida over to the United States. The British signed on to this also, and in this treaty also you start getting the kind of co-sovereignty over Oregon between Britain and the United States. There's a ton of international settlers in the so-called Oregon country. There's native groups, there's American settlers, there's British, there's Russians, there's even some Spanish that have gone a little bit further north. So no one group has enough population to really dominate the place. So under the Transcontinental Treaty, Britain and the United States also agreed to really just run Oregon kind of jointly. So does that make sense? The treaties with Britain. Would Jefferson have supported the invasion of Florida? It's my analysis, yes, because he had already tried it before when he supported Aaron Burr's suggestion of invading Florida. So Jefferson already revealed himself just willing to take Florida by military force if that was the only option on the table. So he probably would have accepted this. Would he have signed on to allow the British to have some say in Oregon? That's questionable. So again, you're getting a kind of mixed bag of foreign policy results with regard to what Jefferson probably thought about this stuff. These are the two major kind of actors in Florida. General Jackson was the guy who led the invasions. And the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, is really running U.S. foreign policy at this point. And he's the one that's signing off on all these treaties, especially with Britain, and to get Florida. So Adams becomes nationally famous as a foreign policy kind of theorist or expert. Spain was not only having problems with Florida and Mexico, but also with its South American colonies. Basically, piece by piece, they are breaking away and becoming independent countries. This is happening all over the place in the Western Hemisphere. South America, Central America, and obviously North America with the newly independent Mexico. So Spain and Portugal, to a lesser extent, are having gigantic problems keeping control over their New World empires. And even the British and the French are having problems keeping control over their islands, especially in the Caribbean. So you have a wave of newly independent indigenous governments in the Western Hemisphere. And Quincy Adams, in particular, had to figure out how the United States should deal with this. Should the United States open relations with these new foreign countries, with these newly independent countries? Should the U.S. try to help the Europeans keep control over their empires? Should the U.S. invade some of these new places and try to gobble them up and make them part of the United States itself? What eventually gets proposed, that Quincy actually wrote, but is presented by the President, James Monroe, in his State of the Union address, and I believe it's 1823. just one paragraph in his State of the Union address that year proposes what eventually becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is a literal proposed deal with the European colonizing powers, the European imperialists. The United States takes the foreign policy stance to oppose any European colonization in the Western Hemisphere, the whole western side of the Atlantic Ocean. So the statement is, the Americas are no longer a place for European colonization. It is official U.S. foreign policy to resist European colonization anywhere in the Americas. And it becomes U.S. policy to support, in many instances, revolutions of some of those American populations against European control. So this is a wide theory of revolution, which seems to be very in line with Jefferson's thought on spreading the world revolution against kings. And Jefferson's idea, and many others' idea from the American Revolution, that the United States Revolution was only the first to take out the king and replace it with a democracy. And that they wanted this to happen throughout Europe, and in this instance, throughout the rest of the Americas. American foreign policy in the Americas will be to support revolutions against European kings and allow these peoples to rule themselves democratically. So every once in a while, the United States will get involved in particularly Latin American independent countries to theoretically defend their independence from Europe. But especially as you get into the late 1800s and the 1900s, beyond the scope of our early American history class, early U.S. history class, eventually the United States goes from supporting their independence to sometimes militarily occupying them to make sure that pro-U.S. leaders are actually put into place and retain control. So the United States eventually becomes a colonizing power in itself, especially in the American hemisphere. But there's also a flip side to this bargain that Monroe proposed to the Europeans. So his idea is, or Adams' idea is, the Europeans stay out of the Americas, and the flip side of that coin is that the Americans will stay out of Europe. The United States will not intervene in European politics. So it is the old idea of drawing a line right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and saying the Europeans stay in Europe, the Americans stay in the Americas. To each side their own. And that is also very Jeffersonian in a lot of ways, because Jefferson hated the Europeans, viewed them as almost kind of barbaric peoples that are always going to war with each other on a constant basis. So Jefferson fell in line, especially with Washington's advice, to not get involved in what they called entangling alliances with European powers. Because if you sign a long-term treaty with France, France is always at war with Britain, so they're going to constantly drag you into wars. So the Monroe Doctrine can be seen as a very Jeffersonian foreign policy, supporting revolution against kings and staying out of European alliances, and out of Europe as much as possible in general. And from 1815 until about the year 1900, the United States, follows this foreign policy. So there's a long, almost century, of the United States trying to avoid European politics as much as possible. And the United States really develops itself independent of what's going on in Europe in a lot of ways, at least militarily. Does the United States still stay out of Europe? Absolutely not. If you ever look on a map of places that the United States has military bases, in almost every European country. So the Monroe Doctrine is even though a lot of it's still talked about in foreign policy circles and defending the Americas from these European incursions. The flip side of that coin has been thrown in the trash long ago, at least 60 years ago by our time. So, questions about the doctrine at all? Are you guys alive?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Just making sure. I don't really even hear anyone breathing anymore, so it's kind of scary. All right. The Republican Party is absolutely dominant after, especially around 1812 or so, to the point where I believe it's in 1812. Even as Madison is leading the United States into this disastrous war, and remember, elections happen early November, right? Madison ran for re-election in the middle of a disastrous war, and still got re-elected, which is uncommon in U.S. history in a lot of ways. Voters tend to turn against presidential candidates who have led the country into catastrophes. The Federalist Party was still around and was still running candidates for the Senate and the House and state houses and the presidency. In 1812, they couldn't even run a Federalist candidate. They chose another Republican and ran him against Madison because the Federalists are so weakened and disorganized by that point. Even after the Republican Party leads the U.S. into that war and suffers the consequences of that decision, the Federalists had really destroyed themselves popularly by advocating secession in the Northeast. So the Federalist Party is basically dead in the water, and almost everybody knows it after 1815. So the Republicans dominate Congress, they keep the presidency, they dominate the state houses, the state governments. The Republicans really have no opposition anymore. They are a unified party. They are pushing their program through Congress very, very easily. They are running the country. And there really is no opposition party to them. One of the beginning stages of the breakdown of that dominance happens in 1819. After the war was over, when the United States started trading with Britain again, they started especially trading cotton. The United States is starting to grow a lot of cotton, sending raw cotton to British factories to be made into clothes and other cotton products, but mostly clothes. So high cotton prices, farmers were, right after the war, when they're allowed to trade with Britain again, the price of cotton booms, which means farmers can make a lot of money off of cotton and the price is rising. So farmers are very optimistic that even if they pay a little bit extra for a certain amount of land to grow cotton, if they think the price of cotton is going to keep going up and up and up, then they can still make their mortgage payment even if they get a mortgage that's too big. Does that make sense? The problem is that in 1819, cotton prices go down a little bit because it was an oversupplied market. When cotton prices go down, you all of a sudden have all these farmers that have kind of an overburdened mortgage. So they got mortgages on their land based on the idea that they can sell their cotton for $1,500 a month. So they got a mortgage at around $1,400 a month, thinking that cotton prices would keep going up to $2,000 or $3,000 a month and can still make profit. When that thing goes down, when their profit goes down to $1,200 a month, they can't make their mortgage payments, and what happens?
Lose.
Yep. Here comes the bank. And they get foreclosed. They lose their land, they lose their property. You get a massive amount of land foreclosures in the West, which means you have a whole lot of former farmers that were buying a lot of stuff, clothes and farming tools and whatnot. Now they're not buying that much, which means the factories making that stuff in the United States don't have as many customers. So the factories start losing money. And what do factory owners start doing in order to balance their books? Yeah, they lay off their workers. So you get what we call a financial panic. In 1819, 1820, that you start to see mass layoffs. Workers have less money to spend on buying things, which means they buy less stuff, which means factories make less stuff. They don't need as many workers, so they lay off more workers. Less workers have money. on and on it goes into really a tailspin right on down the economic toilet. And you get a depression. And a lot of Americans blame the Depression on the creation of the Second Bank of the United States. Because the bank was just created in 1815, and very quickly you have one of the biggest financial panics in the country's history so far. So in a lot of people's minds, they blame the banking system as being, building up this, what for all intents and purposes is a housing bubble. And when it bursts and people are laid off and the economy goes down, a lot of people in the country blame the bankers. So that's one part of the collapse of Republican unity. A lot of Republicans were bankers. And their use of the banking system to build up railroads and all these other kinds of things makes them politically unpopular. A lot of them get kicked out of office. They largely get replaced with other Republicans, though, because the Federalists are basically non-existent. Another thing that starts breaking down the Republican unity is the proposal of Missouri to become a state. Missouri had enough population to apply for statehood. The major problem of this is that by the 1820s, a lot of the northern states that did not have the long-term culture of slavery started eliminating slavery on their own state levels. They made slavery illegal in their individual state. So a lot of northern states are now anti-slavery. The southern states have kept slavery. So you have a growing divide culturally, economically, and politically in the country between a north anti-slave faction and a south pro-slavery faction. The Southerners are very worried that at some point the Northerners will get enough votes in Congress to just write a law that removes slavery from the whole country. In the House of Representatives, what is that membership based on? Who gets the most? Small, huh? Membership in the House is based on population. Who has the most population in the country at this point? The North. That's where the big cities were. That's where the giant population centers were. So the Northerners will always have dominance in the House of Representatives. How do you decide membership in the Senate? It's equality amongst the states. Every state gets 2 senators. At this point, there is exactly as many states in the North as there are in the South. So the Southerners say the only way for, in the long term, for the South to keep slavery is to keep that perfect balance of northern versus southern states. Does that make sense? Or pro-slavery states versus anti-slavery states. Because if the House passes a law, the Senate has to also pass that law, and the President has to sign it. The Southerners say the only way for them to keep slavery is to keep that delicate balance, 50-50. Does that make sense? Because the minute that the Northerners get 1 or 2 more states on their side, they might start trying to pass that law that eradicates slavery from the whole country. And now you have Missouri saying we want to be a state. So the debate is, will Missouri be an anti-slavery state or a pro-slavery state? The Southerners want it to be pro-slavery because they want that balance on their side. So a compromise is eventually reached in 1820. Well, Missouri will enter as a pro-slavery state, but at the exact same moment, they will carve a new state out of Massachusetts, and they'll call it Maine. Massachusetts used to be divided between the little kind of MA part down there and what is today Maine. So they take that northern part and make it into a new anti-slavery state. They both enter at the exact same moment, so the balance is upheld. Does that make sense? This is called the Missouri Compromise. Another part of the compromise is that they draw a line south of Missouri. And they say across this line at 3630, the parallel on the globe, everything south of that line will be open to slavery. All these territories that are going to get carved out, or all these new states are going to get carved out of that territory below that line, and all the states that get created out of the northern part will be anti-slavery. Does that make sense? In a desperate attempt to uphold the balance. But when you look at that line, which side does it seem to favor? Who gets the advantage in that one? The North. Why? Yeah, there's more territory, so, I mean, how many states can you possibly carve out of this little thing, right? You're probably going to get a whole lot more states carved out of the northern half. And the Southerners know it. So in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and 50s, the Southerners will talk about conquering more land to get more access along this line for pro-slavery states. They even talk about invading a lot of the Caribbean islands, especially what is today Cuba, and making it into U.S. states, making a lot of those islands into U.S. states because they're south of the line, so they would be open to slavery. The Southerners are absolutely paranoid to their core that if the North gets more states, it may not happen today, it may not happen 10 years from now, but maybe 20 or 30 years from now, the Northerners will write that law and just eradicate slavery from the whole country, and there's nothing the Southerners would be able to do to stop it. So questions about that at all? That is fundamentally important to understand because that is the conflict that will create the Civil War. They tried to solve the conflict with the Missouri Compromise, but it's a short-term fix, right? There's all this open territory out there, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. Okay, the next thing that really destroys Republican Party unity is the election of 1824. President Monroe was elected in 1816 and re-elected in 1820 overwhelmingly. He served his 2 terms and, according to what was by then normal, he retired after his 2nd term. The problem in 1824 is that the Republicans in his cabinet and in Congress had some very powerful personalities, and a lot of them decide to run for president in 1824. Eventually, you get 5 major candidates. One of the Southern leaders, John Calhoun, I think he's from South Carolina, he was Secretary of War, which is basically today called Secretary of Defense. William Crawford is Secretary of the Treasury. John Quincy Adams is a Northerner from Boston. He's Secretary of State. Henry Clay is a Westerner. He is Speaker of the House of Representatives. And all these guys agreed about economic nationalism. They are all promoting these policies. These were national leaders. And they were nationally recognized as Republican leaders by 1824. The last guy who comes in is the U.S. Army General Andrew Jackson, who had led the defense of New Orleans, who had invaded Florida. So Jackson has a lot of popularity also. And the election of 1824 gets pretty nasty. Calhoun is smart enough to understand that this is going to be a dogfight, and like any kind of very close election, this is going to break down to a kind of image type of race, character race. And Calhoun recognizes this and knows that anyone who's involved in this is going to have their name just dragged to the mud. So Calhoun drops out fairly quickly before the election in order to kind of save his reputation and maybe run for president in some future election. So Calhoun drops out. So you have 4 major candidates. And they're on the ballot. They're all Republicans. And they all go to the November election. And it's obviously a divided vote. Andrew Jackson got the highest amount of the popular vote. He got 43% of the vote of actual living people. Quincy Adams got a little bit less, and you have two lower amounts. But nobody gets a majority of the Electoral College. Jackson got the most at 38%. So at this point, you have a problem. What happens under the Constitution when no presidential candidate gets a majority of the electoral votes? Does anybody know? Not just Congress, the House of Representatives. Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House. He has a big faction in the House that follows him, that are dedicated to him and his ideas. So Henry Clay will drop out because he recognizes he got some of the lowest levels, so he understands he's not going to be able to pull this one out. So he drops out and tries to convince his followers to vote for one of these other guys. Crawford actually has a stroke. So between the election and this vote in the House, Clay drops out, takes his name out of consideration. Crawford has a stroke, so he's hospitalized. No one's going to vote for him. So the election really comes down to the two highest vote getters, Jackson and Adams. So Adams had his power mostly from the Northeast. He was from Boston. His family was from Boston. They were a kind of pro-commerce type of political group, his faction. And you see that Jackson, his vote was in yellow, so he mostly has the vote of the South and a little bit in the West. Clay was in brown. He had a whole lot of the Western vote. So Adams goes to Clay and makes a deal with Clay. The deal is that Clay will deliver his support in the House to Adams. Clay will convince his followers to vote for Adams when it comes down to the vote. So Adams and Clay really combine their strength to win the vote in the House. And the deal is that Adams will make Clay the Secretary of State, which was an important position back then. Because you've already had 4 presidents in a row now that were Secretary of State right before they became president. So it's seen as a kind of leapfrog up to the presidency, kind of stepping stone to the presidency. So Clay is happy. Adams is going to be president. Clay is going to be Secretary of State. And who was pissed off at this?
Jackson.
Jackson and his supporters publicly say that this is a, quote, corrupt bargain. That Clay made this deal, this is a backroom deal, and that Jackson really got hosed in this because Jackson got the most votes, got the highest percentage of the Electoral College, and Jackson is the one cut out. So Jackson and his supporters are enraged to the point where they leave the Republican Party completely and they go off to create an alternative party to oppose Adams in the next election. So Adams becomes president. In 1825, he will have a term as president, and really one of the most miserable terms of any president ever served, because he was accused of being a bastard president right off the bat. So a lot of the Republicans that supported Jackson are now opposing everything that Adams wants to do. They won't pass the laws he wants, and on and on. It's a really kind of horrible time politically for Adams. But Adams got to what was already being called the White House by then, and Jackson and his followers go off and they create what becomes known as the Democratic Party to run against Adams in the re-election attempt in 1828. So questions about that at all? Yeah. Jackson? Yeah, Jackson will win the election in 1828. He'll knock Adams out. So Jackson will become president in 1829. Other questions? All right, and that's the Democratic Party that still exists today. And every once in a while you'll hear them, or their leaders refer to themselves as the Party of Jackson. That's exactly what it means. Okay, some of the transportation things would go over very, very quickly. Europe and particularly Britain are undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Britain really started in the late 1700s, and it was was really, its government was investing in it, so they're growing it purposefully. So they're launching into it very, very quickly and moving forward with it, especially by the 1820s. Britain is the industrial leader of the world. They're building factories, they're building machines to do labor. The Industrial Revolution, its trick is to take all of the muscle labor, the labor that if you're making clothes that people used to sit around and knit with their muscles and literally make clothes with muscle labor, or go out into the fields and move a plow around through either human muscle labor or attach it to an animal and have them drag it around. The trick of industrialization is to take the work that's being done by human or animal muscle labor and relocate that to a machine that can move faster, stronger, and not have to take breaks in between unless the thing breaks or something. So that is the trick of industrialization. Machines work longer hours. They work under greater pressures, greater stress. They can work faster. They churn out more clothes than any one person sitting down can make. So you get a huge amount of more stuff being made for people to buy, which Walmart theory kicks in. Supply and demand. When there's a lot more clothes on the market, clothes get cheaper and cheaper to buy. So people can have access to more clothes, more books, more podiums, more tables, more chairs. I mean, if you think about it, everything you're physically touching right now is made in a factory somewhere, right? Your clothes, your shoes, the chair, the table, the pen, the paper, all this stuff is industrial product. These lights, the carpet, everything. So it has revolutionized our world and made it a world of plenty. Material prosperity. The locomotive was symbolic of the Industrial Revolution, largely because it's the first time that people out in the fields, out in the countryside, had an experience with industrialization. People living out in the farms that don't work in factories or live in big cities, they live the ancient lifestyle of waking up at dawn and going out and tilling the field or harvesting or whatever they're doing. That's the stuff that people have been doing all the way back ever since before even ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. That's been going on for eons. And that lifestyle just hadn't changed much for almost the entire world. The first time that a lot of people experience industrialization is when the railroad is built through their area. And the railroad causes psychological damage. It scars the landscape. It alters the landscape in ways that people previously found unimaginable. They build tracks right across the land, and those tracks largely never leave. When they run into a canyon that they have to go through, because train tracks have to be consistent so the train doesn't crash. Sometimes they build a bridge to span the gap between two different land masses. When they run into a mountain, what do? They dynamite through the mountain. They blow a hole through the thing, which is unimaginable to generations of people that have lived in these lands and viewed that lifestyle of living off the land as almost unalterable. So the Industrial Revolution has huge psychological impacts on people, and a lot of times locomotives are very popular kind of life-changing experiences for a lot of these people, because this is where industrialization comes and has its first kind of real imprint on their lives. In the United States, as the U.S. government started to spend tax revenue to build railroads and canals and all these other kinds of transportation and communication systems, because they're largely being built in the north that link northeastern cities to northwestern farmlands and new industrial centers that start popping up. They start linking the north together. What were different societies now start getting linked together because they can travel from one part to another fairly quickly. And that's important to realize. The old Northwest raised the food and the raw materials, a ton of different things that you can grow, and they were sent to the northeastern cities, the population centers that had to be fed. And the manufactured goods that are made in northeastern factories, shovels, plows, tables, all kinds of things, they go to the northwestern cities, so that eventually this northeastern and northwestern culture becomes very much connected. in a way that separated them as distinct from the South. So over time you get the idea, especially by the 1850s, that there is this one kind of unified North that is very culturally and economically different from the South. And again, that's one of the major kind of cultural divisions that will lead to the Civil War. Up till this point, up till about the 1820s, the United States was a patchwork of different regions. There was a southwestern region based around Louisiana. There's a northwestern region that was almost totally farmland. There's a northeastern big city region. And there was a southern agriculture and pro-slavery region. And piece by piece, they get broken down into just a north and a south over time. And this is one of the kind of major processes that push that development. To give you an idea of what the population growth of the United States looks like, these are the major U.S. cities' population sizes in about the year 1820. So you see that the big dots, like New York, is 100,000 people living in New York City. And New York was obviously the biggest city already. The other old cities that already existed, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, they are fairly sizable but not giants. Just a few decades later, you don't just see the massive growth of the northeastern cities to the point where the cities really grow together. If you travel through those areas today, it's just one giant city. You travel from, say, Washington, D.C. through Baltimore going northeast all the way up to Boston, it's like one just giant metropolis. New Orleans grows, but the southern cities largely don't. These are still agrarian populations. And the size of New York City now expands out to brand new cities by the mid-1800s. St. Louis rises out of really almost nothing. The crossing of a railroad with a river. Same thing with Chicago. Chicago rises out of being a railroad intersection next to a lake. And it was almost nothing in the year 1850. It was literally an intersection of two railroads with a port. But by 1860, it had 100,000 people in it. You see the growth of giant interior cities that become manufacturing towns because they're located either next to the Great Lakes that will get connected to the Atlantic Ocean through a canal system, Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, or attached to the major river systems, Cincinnati, Columbus, Louisville, St. Louis. And the growth of also entire just manufacturing towns like Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Rochester. So you see the northern population is growing dramatically. And the southern population is falling behind fairly quickly. And again, you can see it in the population density compared from 1790, really the first years of the constitutional government, to the most populated areas at that point are now looking exactly like as far west as Illinois and Indiana. So population is growing, it's expanding westward, but not really growing so much in the south, at least not as quickly, not nearly as quickly. And even by 1860, you have California being a state with the major population centers around Sacramento and San Francisco. A lot of these cities are built up as factory towns. And this is a pretty idealistic version of what a factory town would look like. These are literally cities that are built up to put a factory in the middle. And of course, when you have a factory, you have to have a lot of workers, which means you have to build apartments or houses for them to live in, grocery places for them to shop in, churches for them to go to, parks for them to go to. So these cities literally rise out of the fact that there's a factory there that needs a large population and the support system to keep them alive. So a lot of these large cities start growing up. They are first factory towns, and they grow into their own metropolis. A lot of these population numbers are pushed by a gigantic wave of European immigration from the 1820s forward, especially in the 1840s. This is when a lot of Europeans are giving up on their own political systems. There are epidemic revolutions in Europe throughout the 1800s, especially after 1820 or so. And a lot of those peoples start leaving and they go to the United States because there is free land out there, and they can be farmers too. One of the changes is that the immigrants are not so much coming from Northern and Eastern Europe or Western Europe anymore, places like Britain or France. They're now starting to come from the German areas, or Austria, or Italy, or even the Balkan areas. So they are speaking vastly different languages from English, and oftentimes have no desire to really learn English. So they become culturally excluded and politically excluded. And that's something that you obviously see going on in the United States today with immigration from other places. A lot of the U.S. citizens don't like people who refuse to speak English, and so they, knock them out of power whenever they can. But over this time, you get tens of millions, estimated 30 to 40 million new immigrants coming over in waves to the United States. So that obviously contributes to the population growth of the cities, and also especially of the northwestern farmlands. Another major problem of industrialization is that it is dirty and dangerous. These cities become, much as cities are today, dens of sin. Opportunities for people to have a lot of dangerous fun. There's a lot of bars, and in this time, alcohol is being experimented with and becoming hugely, increasingly powerful types of alcohol. Because scientists are basically boiling down alcohol and making it even more potent than it ever was before. So alcohol is a huge danger. Alcoholism skyrockets with all the connected spousal abuse and child abuse and all kinds of things. A lot of these guys went to work 14 hours a day in a factory, 6 days a week, and they often like to take their wages and go into the bar rather than provide for their family. So there's huge amounts of social and family pain that is being created, and especially in these cities because they're dirty. There's a lot of unemployment, which means there's a lot of drunk guys milling around, desperately looking for work. Some have given up and some turn to crime. They turn to stealing, pickpocketing, mugging. So there's a lot of crime in these cities. It's dangerous places. And one of the ways that U.S. society and also British society try to deal with this is to focus on women as being the kind of moral leaders of a family. That women are the ones that teach children how to act and how to protect themselves in these dangerous environments, especially young girls. Women are told that you should teach your children to not look strangers in the eye, don't take candy from strangers, all that kind of stuff, but also tell young girls not to dress too revealingly with a lot of violent and potentially drunk men wandering around in a city that could turn out bad for young women. So you get a moral identity of this idea of being domesticated, having a nice calm family, try to marry a husband who's not going to go off and waste your paycheck out in the bar or out in the whorehouse basically. There is a worship of morality. And it's very heavily identified with women at that point. Because women were supposed to be the great kind of teachers of virtue in the family. And women were identified as, the leaders of the family. They keep the house, they raise the kids, so it's their responsibility to teach the kid moral values and make sure that they turn out to be a decent adult, hopefully. Is that moral code still with women today?
Yes.
Absolutely, without a doubt. There's still a lot of people in society who frown on women getting jobs and leaving the house and doing anything other than, having babies and washing dishes. And there's still a lot of, obviously, social antagonism against women who enjoy dating different men or enjoy dressing revealingly. I mean, there is a giant social stigma against women for doing that kind of stuff, right? And I'm going to go spend a day in a high school tomorrow. I'm going to hear it all day long. These girls accusing each other of being horrible individual people just based on how they dress. And it's a disgusting thing, but it's a holdover from this society. And since many of us are raised in this so deeply, we see it as so normal that we don't question it. if you do want to question it, there's a really good feminist club on campus, the Chaffey College Feminist Club, and they debate these things. They have teachers show up and give presentations on the history of this stuff, and there's a real good conference, I think it was 2 weeks ago, from the sociology department talking about the social aspects of all this. And this stuff is ongoing, very obviously. So that's some of the social ramifications. The goal of the Industrial Revolution is mass production. The goal of building a factory is to make a lot of stuff and sell it to make a lot of money. So the Industrial Revolution launches forward, and they build increasingly powerful machines that rely on increasingly powerful sources of power. They go from water wheels, and they go to steam engines, and eventually by the late 1800s, early 1900s, they get the harnessing of electricity and gasoline to fuel their engines, which is largely where we are today. But these machines are so self-directed in a lot of ways that any person off the street could probably run the machine. You don't have to be hugely educated or skilled. You don't have to spend your life as an apprentice like you would to be a master carpenter or something. You can come in and learn how to run one of these machines in just a couple days and then be an independent worker in the factory. So workers are, at best, semi-skilled and usually almost completely unskilled. And factory owners love that, because if any worker is working too slow, or if any worker, say, gets their arm ripped off by a machine, you just fire that person and bring someone out from the unemployment line and replace that worker. So workers had a very low wages, because if you complained, you can always be fired. These were dangerous working conditions. They were long hours. And any attempts at unionization were met with mass layoffs. So this is a tough time for workers, and this is what industrial labor will come to look like by about the early 1900s. This is dangerous stuff. It is dirty conditions. People get diseases in these places that kill them, that incapacitate them. People are commonly damaged by the machines, and there's no worker compensation, there's no social security. If you get your arm ripped off and you get fired, you might just starve to death because you have no money. This is a very tough time for workers. And within a few generations, the American population, much like the European population, has to adapt to what these cities look like by the early 1900s. And this is a dramatic difference from the way peoples had always lived since the very first farming cities way back in ancient history, way back in ancient Mesopotamia. People had always lived in farming communities, and life just hadn't changed much. But within just a few decades, life changes on a daily basis, on a physical basis, dramatically. And people have to figure out how to deal with that. And that's a major problem going forward. So questions about any of this? The United States starts taking the first steps into industrialization in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, but does not launch into full-bore industrialization until after the Civil War, until after 1865. So a lot of this is the story of modern U.S. history during and after Reconstruction. But the United States is taking those first small steps forward in the 1820s and up until the 1850s before the war breaks out.